It started with a routine archive review inside one of the monarchy's most protected administrative corridors until someone realized an entire sequence of royal documents no longer matched the records. At first, officials treated it as clerical noise. Then Prince William reportedly asked a question no one in the room wanted to answer. Who had access, and why did nobody notice sooner? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The first reaction, according to various interpretations circulating around royal commentary circles, was not panic. It was restraint. Quiet restraint. The kind that exists inside institutions built on continuity, protocol, and the belief that every discrepancy has an explanation, if enough time and enough people are assigned to it. Palace administrative reviews happen constantly. Records move, archives expand, labels change, transfers occur between departments. Nobody immediately assumed something had gone wrong. But this review was different. Reports suggest the discovery emerged during what should have been an uneventful internal examination of historical and administrative records, one of those deeply procedural exercises that rarely attracts attention and almost never becomes public conversation. Staff reportedly began cross-checking document references against internal logs when something small appeared out of place. Not a missing folder, not an obvious gap, something subtler. A sequence no longer aligned. One reference pointed to another that no longer existed. At first, explanations came quickly. Clerical error, duplicate indexing, mislabeling during transition periods, temporary transfer to another department. Those familiar with institutional archives would later suggest those explanations made sense. Large systems generate noise. Mistakes happen. But according to insiders cited in speculative media conversations, what unsettled people was not the missing material itself. It was how difficult it suddenly became to explain where it had gone. As review teams retraced administrative steps, reports suggest internal conversations became noticeably narrower. Questions that would normally circulate freely reportedly stayed confined to smaller groups. Access requests became more controlled. Follow-up reviews were quietly authorized, and then, according to Palace Watch reporting and commentary, Prince William was informed. Not publicly, not through formal announcement, privately. The timing of that briefing remains unclear, and no verified public account confirms exactly how it unfolded. But multiple interpretations suggest William learned of the discrepancy before any broader institutional disclosure. That detail alone changed the atmosphere surrounding the issue. Because if the concern had remained procedural, it likely would have stayed procedural. Instead, reports claim William's immediate focus was not on the content. It was on the process. Who reviewed it last? Who signed movement logs? Who approved transfers? And perhaps most importantly, why had nobody escalated the inconsistency sooner? Sources discussing the matter describe a shift in tone rather than action. No dramatic orders, no public declarations, just more questions, more reviews, more requests for certainty. Behind the scenes, staff reportedly received instructions to avoid unnecessary discussion while records underwent verification. Officially, that would not be unusual. Institutions protect incomplete information all the time. Unofficially, the silence created its own gravity. People noticed. Observers began pointing to subtle changes that may have meant nothing individually but appeared unusual together. Adjusted schedules, closed-door meetings, reduced visibility around administrative movement. Royal reporters and media insiders started asking whether something internal had changed. Most stories never moved beyond whispers, but whispers have a strange way of surviving. And when speculation began connecting the missing material, not to ceremonial history, but to records allegedly touching succession-era administration, the atmosphere reportedly changed again. Because succession is not routine. Succession is continuity. Succession is structure. And suddenly, what had begun as a quiet archive review no longer looked like paperwork. It looked like something else entirely. But what first appeared to be administrative confusion soon raised a more unsettling possibility. Had someone removed the documents intentionally? Royal documents are rarely just paper. They are memory, authority, and continuity compressed into folders, signatures, and sealed instructions. That was the realization quietly settling over the institution as the earlier questions refused to disappear. Because once the initial explanations had been exhausted, clerical error, administrative overlap, temporary transfer, what remained was not certainty. It was discomfort. And discomfort inside systems built on order rarely stays contained for long. For generations, the monarchy has operated on something larger than ceremony. Public appearances may define its image, but records define its survival. Documents inside royal administration are not treated as ordinary archives. Reports and historical commentary often describe them as the invisible architecture of continuity, records of decisions, transitions, protocols, correspondence, administrative authorizations, and institutional memory stretching across decades. Most never become public. Most were never meant to. That is why, according to various interpretations circulating among palace observers, concern reportedly centered less on what might have been missing and more on what missing material could represent. Precedent. Because in institutions shaped by tradition, precedent matters almost as much as policy. One misplaced item can be corrected. One unexplained gap becomes a question. But a gap that appears during a period of transition becomes something else entirely. And timing, according to those speculating on the matter, was impossible to ignore. The modern monarchy has spent recent years navigating a complicated landscape, generational change, evolving responsibilities, renewed public scrutiny, and the quiet administrative weight that accompanies every shift in royal hierarchy. Historical comparisons began appearing almost immediately among commentators. Not because anyone claimed history was repeating itself, but because royal transitions have always created periods of unusual sensitivity. Moments when institutions become hyper-aware of continuity. Moments when records become symbols. Moments when administrative decisions carry emotional weight far beyond paperwork. Reports suggest internal concern was shaped by exactly that fear, not financial value, not scandal, not embarrassment, but the possibility that even a small inconsistency could create larger questions about stewardship. Palace insiders quoted indirectly across speculative discussions allegedly described an atmosphere that became increasingly restrained. Conversations reportedly narrowed. Fewer assumptions were made. Language became more careful. People stopped speaking in conclusions and started speaking in possibilities. Could the discrepancy be harmless? Could it have existed unnoticed for years? Could there be a procedural explanation nobody had uncovered yet? Questions multiplied faster than answers. And while outside observers searched for personalities and motives, accounts suggest Prince William appeared increasingly uninterested in that direction. The focus reportedly remained procedural, not who benefits, not who is blamed, but what failed. People familiar with institutional leadership often describe moments like this as revealing. Some leaders search for narratives, others search for systems. According to emerging interpretations, William reportedly wanted process reconstructed before speculation accelerated. Access chains reviewed, administrative movement understood, internal assumptions challenged. Because personalities create headlines, process creates answers. That distinction began changing the atmosphere around the issue. And perhaps that was the most revealing development of all, because the conversation was no longer about preserving appearances. It was becoming about understanding vulnerability. And once questions of access emerged, attention shifted away from history and toward people. There was no public statement, no dramatic appearance, only reports of a private directive that changed the mood inside royal administration overnight. By that stage, the conversation had already begun drifting away from documents and toward responsibility. The earlier uncertainty had created tension, but tension alone does not transform internal concern into institutional action. What changes everything is the moment someone decides uncertainty is no longer acceptable. According to various interpretations and speculative reporting around the issue, that moment reportedly came when Prince William moved away from narrow verification and towards something broader. Not selective checks, not isolated corrections, a complete review. If earlier stages had been built around explanation, this phase appeared built around reconstruction. Reports suggest William's position was straightforward in principle, even if difficult in execution. If a discrepancy existed, then the objective was not simply to locate appeared missing. It was to understand the chain of events that made the discrepancy possible in the first place. That distinction mattered, because searching for a document assumes an outcome. Reconstructing a process accepts uncertainty, and uncertainty has a way of making people uncomfortable. Accounts circulating among palace observers suggest administrative teams were quietly tasked with something far more demanding than a standard audit. Timelines were reportedly revisited, movement logs reviewed, authorization pathways examined, administrative handoffs reconsidered, internal assumptions tested against actual records. What happened? When? Who knew? Who confirmed? Who assumed someone else had already checked? Questions became methodical. The atmosphere reportedly became heavier, not dramatic, not chaotic, heavier. Because inside structured institutions, pressure rarely arrives through confrontation. It arrives through silence, through meetings becoming shorter, through language becoming more precise, through people realizing routine answers are no longer enough. Reports suggest aides and support staff began feeling the weight of that shift. Nobody publicly accused anyone. Nobody reportedly declared wrongdoing, and that may have made the situation more difficult. Blame gives people something to resist. Process forces people to look inward. According to commentaries surrounding the situation, William's reported approach remained unusually restrained. The emphasis, insiders suggested, was not punishment. It was institutional protection. That distinction repeated itself quietly. Protect the system. Protect continuity. Protect confidence. Because assigning blame before understanding failure creates headlines. Understanding failure prevents repetition. Still, restraint rarely survives public curiosity. Outside palace walls, something else had started happening. People noticed the absence of answers. Schedules remained unusually controlled. Public messaging stayed ordinary. No clarifications emerged. No dramatic denials appeared. And in the modern media cycle, silence rarely reduces speculation. It expands it. Commentators began filling empty space with theories. Was this routine? Was this symbolic? Was this connected to transition planning? Had concerns existed longer than anyone realized? Questions multiplied faster than facts. And with each unanswered question, attention moved further from administration and closer to individuals. Yet, according to the narrative emerging around William's role, he reportedly refused to let personalities define the process. Stay with evidence. Stay with sequence. Stay with procedure. Because once institutions begin reacting emotionally, clarity becomes harder to recover. But investigations rarely stay contained once questions begin spreading beyond palace walls. In institutions built on discretion, trust becomes the first casualty of uncertainty. By now, the questions had escaped the boundaries of administration and entered something far more difficult to control: perception. Not public confirmation, not official acknowledgement, perception. And institutions that survive across generations understand something most modern organizations learn too late. Once confidence begins to thin, people do not simply ask what happened. They begin asking how something like this could happen at all. That subtle shift reportedly changed everything. Until this point, discussions had revolved around absence, missing references, misaligned records, administrative inconsistencies. But according to various interpretations surrounding the situation, the language inside review conversations allegedly began changing. No longer, what is missing instead? What allowed this to happen? That difference may sound procedural. It rarely is. Because when systems stop investigating outcomes and begin investigating conditions, the circle of scrutiny widens. Reports suggest document access procedures quietly became more restrictive. Not dramatic lockdowns, not visible overcorrections, more controlled permissions, more verification layers, more deliberate movement between departments. The kind of changes that rarely attract attention from outsiders but are impossible for insiders to miss. People reportedly noticed Routine requests allegedly became slower. Approvals became narrower. Questions received fewer immediate answers. The institution appeared to be protecting itself while trying not to appear defensive. And that balancing act created its own pressure. According to speculative reporting and commentary, internal reviews reportedly expanded beyond the original area of concern and into adjacent administrative functions. Not because additional issues had been confirmed, but because institutions under stress often widen the frame before, narrowing conclusions. Records connect to approvals. Approvals connect to oversight. Oversight connects to accountability. And accountability is rarely comfortable. Accounts discussing the atmosphere during this period describe a strange contradiction taking shape. Activity increased while visibility decreased. More meetings reportedly occurred. More reviews continued. Yet outwardly, the public rhythm appeared almost unchanged. That silence created room, and room creates interpretation. Observers began examining routine appearances, ordinary schedules, standard interactions, searching for meaning inside moments that may have meant nothing at all. A delayed appearance became a theory. A shorter engagement became a question. A neutral expression became commentary. Because once people believe something is happening behind closed doors, every ordinary moment starts feeling coded. Reports suggest senior figures inside the broader structure were allegedly briefed gradually rather than all at once. Again, no public confirmation exists for how those conversations unfolded. But the idea itself fueled speculation. Why stagger information? Why control timing? Why maintain such restraint? Some interpreted caution. Others interpreted concern. And concern, once attached to silence, grows quickly. Meanwhile, according to the narrative surrounding William's reported role, the approach remained notably consistent. Do not speculate. Do not personalize. Understand the process. Protect confidence. That strategy may have prevented panic, but it could not prevent curiosity. Because by then, the questions had evolved again. People were no longer asking whether records had become difficult to explain. They were beginning to ask whether someone, somewhere, understood more than they had admitted. And once that possibility entered the conversation, uncertainty stopped feeling administrative. Then came the possibility that transformed concern into something far more serious. The most uncomfortable questions are rarely asked first. They arrive only after every simpler explanation begins to collapse. By the time the conversation reached this stage, something had changed, not in the records themselves, but in the way people were talking about them. Earlier, uncertainty had still felt manageable, administrative, temporary, a problem waiting for a reasonable explanation. But once enough reasonable explanations begin to weaken under scrutiny, attention naturally moves toward possibilities people never wanted to entertain in the first place. And that is where the atmosphere reportedly became most difficult to navigate. Because uncomfortable questions do not arrive dramatically. They arrive quietly, one after another. Could this still be an error? Could timelines have been logged incorrectly? Could procedural overlap create the appearance of absence where none actually existed? Could multiple departments have assumed responsibility at the same time and accountability at none? According to various interpretations circulating around the situation, these possibilities continued to dominate internal thinking for longer than outsiders realized. Reports suggest no immediate leap was made toward alarming conclusions. If anything, the opposite allegedly happened. The effort remained centered on exhausting ordinary explanations before considering extraordinary ones. And there were still many. Administrative oversight, record duplication, legacy filing structures. Procedural gaps created across periods of transition. Each explanation appeared plausible in isolation. But institutions are not judged by isolated explanations. They are judged by whether explanations remain consistent when examined together. That, according to commentary surrounding the matter, became increasingly difficult. Outside observers sensed the shift long before they understood it. Speculation started moving faster than information. Royal commentators, media panels, and public discussion spaces began circling familiar questions with growing intensity. Nobody had confirmed wrongdoing. Nobody had publicly suggested intentional action. Yet uncertainty itself became the story. People filled silence with theories. Some argued it was simply institutional complexity being mistaken for secrecy. Others suggested transitions naturally expose administrative weaknesses. Others still viewed the entire situation as an example of what happens when modern expectations collide with systems designed around discretion. But across nearly every interpretation, one idea kept resurfacing: vulnerability. Not vulnerability in the dramatic sense, institutional vulnerability. Because periods of transition, even orderly ones, create pressure points. Expectations rise, processes accelerate, responsibilities shift. And when people begin wondering whether systems are as stable as they appear, confidence becomes harder to preserve than reputation. That context reportedly shaped William's response. According to accounts and commentary interpreting his approach, he continued resisting conclusions that moved faster than evidence. Reports suggest he remained focused on one principle above all others. Assumption is not proof. That position may have frustrated speculation, but it also revealed something important. If the concern had been image alone, a simple explanation could have ended the discussion. If the concern had been publicity, stronger messaging could have redirected attention. Instead, the emphasis reportedly stayed on understanding. Evidence before interpretation. Sequence before narrative. Process before personalities. Because beneath every rumor and every theory sat a more uncomfortable reality. This was no longer being treated as a question about documents. It was becoming a question about confidence. Trust that records mean what they say. Trust that systems function as intended. Trust that continuity remains stronger than uncertainty. And once trust becomes part of the equation, every answer matters more than the original question. And whatever the answer turned out to be, the response would reshape more than a filing system. Every generation of the monarchy inherits more than titles, it inherits unfinished responsibilities. And perhaps that was the point where the conversation stopped feeling temporary. Because until now, the questions had still lived inside systems, procedures, records, and review processes. Difficult questions, certainly. Uncomfortable ones. But questions that belonged to administration. Yet once trust entered the discussion, the issue changed shape entirely. Trust does not belong to paperwork. Trust belongs to legacy. And legacy, more than almost anything else, is what institutions fear losing. According to interpretations surrounding the unfolding situation, the concern was never framed as a missing object or a bureaucratic inconvenience. Increasingly, commentary began describing it as something heavier, a test of stewardship. That word appeared repeatedly. Stewardship. The idea that every generation inherits structures it did not build and carries obligations it did not choose. The monarchy, in that interpretation, does not simply pass down authority. It passes down responsibility. Responsibility to preserve continuity. Responsibility to maintain confidence. Responsibility to leave systems stronger than they were received. And that may explain why the reported response surrounding Prince William continued, appearing unusually measured even as speculation intensified. Because scandal reacts, responsibility absorbs. Reports and commentaries suggested the focus remained remarkably consistent. Understand the process, protect institutional confidence, and resist transforming uncertainty into spectacle. To some observers, that restraint looked calculated. To others, it looked necessary, because history offers uncomfortable reminders that records sometimes become larger than the records themselves. Moments of transition have always carried symbolic weight. Administrative decisions become interpreted as values. Procedures become interpreted as intentions. Archives become interpreted as memory. And once memory feels vulnerable, people begin asking whether continuity itself has become vulnerable too. That may sound dramatic, but institutions built across generations rarely measure risk in headlines. They measure risk in confidence. Commentary increasingly drew comparisons not to specific historical crises, but to broader periods where public expectation changed faster than institutional habits. The underlying pattern remained familiar. The quieter institutions become, the louder interpretation grows. and interpretation had become impossible to ignore. Questions no longer stayed inside royal reporting. People began discussing transparency, not because explanations had disappeared, but because expectations had changed. What once would have remained internal now existed in an environment where silence itself becomes information. That pressure reportedly changed the atmosphere again. Not visibly, not publicly, but internally, accounts suggested the weight was becoming harder to contain. Because maintaining restraint becomes increasingly difficult once every delay creates another question. Every unanswered detail becomes a theory. Every routine appearance becomes a signal. Every ordinary decision begins carrying symbolic meaning. And somewhere inside that pressure sat an uncomfortable truth. If answers eventually arrived, they would not simply explain records. They would reveal priorities, reveal processes, reveal how institutions respond when confidence begins to feel fragile. Which may explain why reports continued portraying William's approach less as damage control and more as obligation. Not protecting an image, protecting continuity. Because the burden of inheritance is rarely about preserving what already exists. It is deciding what must survive after uncertainty passes. By then, the question was no longer whether answers would come, but what those answers would cost. There are moments when institutions reveal what matters most, not through speeches, but through what they choose to protect. By now, the pressure had become impossible to treat as temporary. For a while, restraint had worked. Controlled language, limited discussion, quiet reviews, careful distance between speculation and process. But institutions can only absorb uncertainty for so long before they are forced into something more difficult than explanation. Action. Not loud action, decisive action. According to interpretations and commentaries surrounding the situation, this was the point where internal movement reportedly accelerated, not because conclusions had been reached, but because waiting itself had begun carrying risk. The logic appeared to shift. Earlier stages asked whether the issue could be understood. Now the question became whether confidence could remain intact while understanding continued. Reports suggest procedural responses reportedly became broader and more structured. Internal accountability conversations allegedly expanded. Reviews became less focused on locating answers and more focused on preventing future uncertainty. Conversations around access, oversight, verification, and institutional safeguards reportedly gained urgency. And that change mattered. Because once an institution starts discussing reform, it quietly acknowledges that confidence alone is no longer enough. According to speculation and public commentary, outside narratives had already moved ahead of internal caution. Public discussion increasingly wanted dramatic conclusions, a responsible party, a defining revelation. Something simple enough to explain uncertainty and close the story. But institutions rarely operate that way. Their instinct is different. Reduce instability. Preserve continuity. Prevent the next problem before explaining the last one. Reports interpreting William's role suggested that distinction remained central to his approach. Restoration over spectacle. Process over performance. Not because questions did not matter, but because reacting emotionally to pressure can sometimes damage confidence more than uncertainty itself. That reportedly shaped the next phase. The objective no longer appeared to be proving certainty to everyone. It became demonstrating seriousness, showing that procedures matter, showing that records matter, showing that trust is protected even when answers remain incomplete. And perhaps that was the most revealing part of all. Because institutions do not reveal priorities during calm periods. They reveal them during moments when protecting one thing means exposing another. Calls for accountability reportedly became more visible in public conversation. Some demanded more transparency. Others argued institutions should remain insulated from pressure until reviews conclude. The divide grew sharper. One side wanted immediate clarity. The other wanted controlled certainty. Neither side trusted delay. Meanwhile, internally, if commentary is to be believed, the atmosphere reportedly remained unusually disciplined. No declarations, no dramatic reversals, just continued emphasis on stewardship. Protect the records, protect continuity, protect confidence. Because if uncertainty had exposed a weakness, then response would define whether that weakness became permanent. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the emotional center of the story began changing. People stopped asking whether something had gone wrong. They began asking what the institution would become afterward. Because once confidence is tested, restoration becomes more important than explanation. And in the aftermath, attention turned from what disappeared to what would remain. Long after headlines fade, institutions are remembered not for the crisis but for how they answered it. And perhaps that was always where this story was heading. Not toward revelation, not toward a dramatic confession, not toward a single moment where every uncertainty suddenly became clear. Because by the time the pressure settled and the speculation exhausted itself, the deeper question was no longer whether every missing detail would eventually be explained. It was whether the institution itself would respond in a way that justified the confidence placed in it. That distinction changed everything. In the beginning, attention had centered on absence, missing references, misaligned records, administrative uncertainty. But over time, something more difficult emerged beneath those questions. Expectation. The expectation that institutions entrusted with continuity must demonstrate that continuity matters. According to interpretations surrounding the situation, resolution reportedly became less about accusation and more about process. Not because questions disappeared, not because curiosity faded, but because institutions rarely secure trust by identifying one moment or one individual and declaring the problem solved. They secure trust by proving systems can endure uncertainty without collapsing into confusion. Reports and commentary increasingly frame the response in those terms: review, reconstruction, accountability, reassurance. Not dramatic words, but powerful ones. Because in moments like these, the public often waits for spectacle, while institutions quietly attempt something more difficult: restoration. That may explain why the narrative surrounding Prince William remained remarkably consistent from beginning to end. According to reports and speculation interpreting his approach, the emphasis reportedly focused on institutional credibility rather than personal vindication. The goal was never presented as winning a public argument or ending discussion overnight. It was preserving confidence, showing that procedures matter, showing that stewardship matters, showing that responsibility cannot become optional simply because uncertainty becomes uncomfortable. That approach did not eliminate questions, and perhaps it was never meant to. Because not every investigation ends with complete certainty. Not every concern receives a satisfying explanation. Some moments leave behind incomplete answers and clearer priorities. And that may be what remained here. The public, according to this interpretation, was left with something unusual. Not total closure, but visible action. Not complete understanding, but evidence that concerns were treated seriously. Not certainty, but process. And sometimes institutions survive not because they remove every doubt, but because they prove doubt itself will not dictate decisions. That is the uncomfortable reality of continuity. It does not promise perfection. It promises persistence. Years from now, people may not remember the details that fueled speculation. They may not remember timelines, reviews, or administrative language. Those details fade. What remains are the choices made under pressure. Whether responsibility outweighed convenience, whether caution outweighed reaction, whether stewardship outweighed spectacle. Because legacy is rarely built during calm periods. It is built during moments when uncertainty demands a response, and someone chooses responsibility anyway. And perhaps that is why the final lesson of this story was never about records at all. It was about what institutions owe to the future. Because documents can vanish, rumors can multiply, and headlines can move on, but institutions survive only if someone insists that every missing page still matters. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.